bringing in those brand values, ensuring that what we do for our product design, part of the brand, it's not separate, it lives within the brand because it's expressing the same intent that the brand ultimately wants to express.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into Nodes of Design. To help support our mission spread knowledge, we have a very special guest in today's episode. Let's welcome Alexander, a globally recognized design leader with nearly 20 years of experience envisioning, shipping and creating next generation consumer and B2B products. He leads and motivates teams demonstrating proven success in various environments, including from global scale tech companies to mid-size and bootstrap startups. He is regularly sought after as a mentor and speaker. Alexander actively contributes to industry events and organizations in United States and Australia. His exceptional contributions to design have been recognized by renowned award bodies such as RedDot, One Show, the Emmy Awards, and countless others. In this episode, Alexander had shared great insights on the intersection of digital design and branding. We started the episode by Alexander retracing his steps into the world of design. He shares personal anecdotes, invaluable lessons, and golden nuggets of advice for the beginners venturing into design. And then we spoke about the confluence where digital design meets branding and understand why its union is lifeblood of today's digital ecosystem. Then we delve into the crucial considerations one must keep in mind to ensure digital design resonates with brands' ethos. And then we spoke about the power of storytelling in digital design and branding. We then spoke about how does one can gauge the success of their design strategies in fortifying the brand's awareness and fostering a customer loyalty. Throughout the episode, Alexander has shared some tried and tested strategies with us. So prepare to be enlightened, inspired, and equipped with knowledge that could redefine your design strategies. Whether you are a beginner, a professional, or someone curious about design and branding, this episode with Alexander is a must listen. Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into Nodes of Design. In this episode, we have a very special guest with us. Hi Alexander, welcome to Nodes of Design.
Hi, Jace. Thanks for having me.
So Alexander, how was your day so far?
It's been busy. This time of year is particularly busy for us at Nokia. Lots of new projects coming in, lots of projects already in flux, and just generally a lot of things happening. So it's a busy time, but busyness is generally good. I think that there's nothing worse for designers to be sitting around idle and waiting for things to come in. We like the fast-paced environment, and that's definitely what we have at Nokia. So it's nice to be able to at least experience some of that. Of course, it's good to have some quieter periods every now and then, but I think everyone who works at Nokia Design is really passionate about design and they want to be doing more of it. So busyness is something that we don't necessarily see as a negative. We see that as an opportunity to do more work and to be pushing ourselves even further.
That's really cool, Alexander. So if you could give a brief about yourself to our audience out there.
Yeah, for sure. So, firstly, thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me to the podcast. I've watched a few episodes and it's really cool what you guys have been doing. And I have connected with a variety of Indian designers in the last few months. And I think I mentioned it to you before that there seems to be so much talent in that region. So I'm really excited to be able to play a role in that and help, I guess, educate and provide some insights to the next generation of Indian designers, since it is such an area or a region that seems to be producing so much in the way of design talent. And I can definitely see that being a big industry moving forward. A little bit of background on me. So I'm currently working as head of design at Nokia, and I've been there for the last 3 years. And essentially that's overseeing a global team of designers from really everywhere. We have, I would say, the majority of the team based in San Francisco, which is where I used to be based. I'm currently now based in Sydney, Australia. That's where I'm originally from. You can probably tell that by my accent. But after 6 years in the United States with COVID and all that kind of stuff, we thought it was a good time, me and my family, to move back to Australia and be with family and all that kind of stuff. So now I work remotely in Australia and I work with my team in San Francisco, but we also have designers at various places throughout the world: South Korea, Spain, UK, Finland, all of these places. And that really gives us an around-the-clock type of presence when it comes to the work that we're doing. So we're able to be quite efficient in that sense. What we generally do is is design digital products, mostly in the B2B space when it comes to managing networks. A lot of people know Nokia as being this mobile phone company that was around in the 90s and 2000s. And a lot of people still see that when I talk to people out in the street and I say I work at Nokia, they're like, oh, I haven't seen a Nokia phone for a while. Or they say, oh, I love my 3210 Nokia mobile phone from 10 years ago. They don't make phones like that anymore. And I'm like, yeah, I totally agree. But Nokia in 2023 doesn't really do much in that mobile phone telecom space. What we generally focus more on is network management, B2B types of enterprise software. And there is small areas where we focus more on the innovation side of things. Sustainability is a big one for us. How do we create products that are doing good for the world as opposed to, just contributing to a lot of the issues that we have. Prior to that, like I said, I've been at Nokia for 3 years, and in total, I've been working as a designer for about 20 years. And I feel really grateful, to be honest, to have worked in so many different settings. One of my first roles was working in Thailand, where serendipitously I met someone who was starting up a business in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and wanted to start creating interfaces for PDA phones, so the old Windows mobile phones. This is in 2006, so before the iPhone was around. And I worked there for about a year, and it was a really interesting crash course into how to design for mobile. No one was talking about mobile at that time. Just was unheard of. And I just, found myself working in that environment. And I was really surprised at just the level of talent and just the knowledge that was surrounding all of these products that we were developing. So I did that for a while, and that was a really good apprenticeship into the importance of mobile and potentially a bit of insight into what mobile is going to become. We didn't know about the iPhone, but it felt like that there was definitely something brewing in that space, even with those old versions of smartphones that were available at that time. So that was great. And, since then, I came back to Australia. I worked in, digital agencies where I felt that was really where things were happening at that time. And that's the mid-2000s period where a lot of the innovation, a lot of the new thinking that I think even now when we look at product design and how much it's evolved since those early agency days, that agency setting that almost broke away from the traditional advertising environment, that integrated environment, was really doing some interesting things. And it always felt like we were being really rebellious in the work that we did because we were using new technology. We were jumping on things just as it was released, and we were creating things that were really creative and to some extent really wrote the blueprint on how product design has now materialized in different settings. I think that often you don't hear about that, but there is a lot to attribute to those early days of digital agencies in what we now know as product design, and to what we see with all these startups and companies trying to replicate. It has origins in those early days. I've also worked in the bigger advertising agencies as well. I think you get to a certain part in your career and you start to develop more experience, and those offers from the big integrated agencies, come your way. And to some extent, you feel like you have to sell your soul in order to do that. And I think that generally is the compromise. But I did that for a bit. Then I went on to start my own agency for about 3 years. And I worked with a partner, and we developed that over 3 years and got some really good clients. But ultimately, I was finding myself more and more removed from the creative work, from the design. I was spending more time dealing with client issues, attending boardroom meetings, and just feeling like I was losing my grip on the creative output. And when I started that business, it was all about, I want to create something that I'm really proud of. And I felt that slipping away or slipping between my fingers a little bit. After a lot of, self-discovery, I decided that wasn't right for me. And then, I headed over to the US for the next few years to do that. To your second point, I guess, but yeah, it's been great to be able to see the different changes of design and how the cycles reappear and how phases happen. And even in the time that's relatively quite short, there's been so many transitions and different phases in design that I feel privileged to have experienced on some level. So yeah, I think that hopefully gives a little bit of background on my story, but also a little bit of my perspective on design and how I value all of that diversity and experience over the years, and what that has now led me to be a better designer. Yeah, some tips to designers who are out there trying to find their way into the industry. And it's someone that I have a lot of sympathy for, because there are so many designers out there graduating. It seems like more and more designers are coming out every year, and that makes it really difficult to stand out in the crowd. what can you do about that? Like, how do you give yourself a competitive edge? It's not easy, but there definitely are some things that you can put in place in order to give you a better chance than the person next to you. Because that's really all you got to do. You know, a lot of the times when you're interviewing for an internship or even an entry level role, you're up against maybe 5 others, and you don't have to be better than every single graduate designer out there. You just need to be better than the 5 other ones that you're interviewing with. But I have a couple of points that that I think I've always given to young designers, because I think that when designers come out of college, they are perhaps not prepared for some of the nuances in finding work, and I guess understanding what they continually need to be doing as they're growing and as they're developing their skills. There is a sense almost like, I've graduated, now I'm ready to go, I want a job, I just want to start designing. But that's just the beginning. Like, there's so much more that needs to be learned. And I would say that's, you know, something that you could probably even do before you graduate, but is finding a good mentor. And I think the best mentors that I've had have been people that I've worked with. I know that there's a lot of platforms now that can basically coordinate mentors with other designers, and they're able to have a little bit of dialogue. But I think the best mentorship comes from that on-the-job experience, because you can understand how that relates to the day-to-day type of work. And it also allows you to provide some level of pre-qualification to that mentor. If you're choosing a random mentor on, you know, you don't know much about them, you'll have to really believe what they say, but what they're saying may not necessarily be true. But if you're looking at a mentor in a really good company, they've kind of paid their dues, you would assume, to some extent. So they probably know more of what they're talking about. So I would say first and foremost, like, really go into a new role or an internship and, you know, ask people for their mentorship. And it doesn't have to be one person necessarily. You can learn something from everyone, even different disciplines. But it's important to have a mentor that you respect, and a mentor that other people respect and has done really good things in their career, because that's ultimately what you're going to start to become if you're really taking on board the advice and the strategies that they're giving you. They're not going to be able to teach you to be better than them, but they'll be able to teach you to be as good as them, or at least start working towards that. So knowing that, you know, there's some level of credibility with that mentor is something that you perhaps want to research on and ask around and validate. So that's the first thing, like getting a mentor, find a mentor. Second thing is, I would say, is craft over everything when you're early on in your career. There's so much. Design is encompassing of so much right now. Like, it's research, it's everything. Like, you could almost say entire organizations, everyone who works in those organizations are a designer. But I see a lot of portfolios coming in for intern applications and even in entry-level applications, and I get the same process. I get the problem statement, and all this, the layout is all the same, and I've seen it 1,000 times. And what I rarely see is beautiful craft. And to me, that's what I look for. And I don't just mean I only care about visual design and I only care about aesthetics. But what I do care about is design sensibility, is someone that could determine this works from a design standpoint. And it's the same for hiring UX researchers or even engineers. I want to be able to see that design sensibility, because without that, it's hard to produce on your vision. It's hard if you can't correlate the entire team to understand why we value the same things. It's really difficult to do that. Spending time, and even if you've learned in college that you need to focus on all of this additional research and formulation of how work is developed, that's fine. You could learn that later, and I'm sure in a couple of years' time, those methodologies will be completely different than what they are now. So rather than chasing that rabbit, invest in your craft and spend more time developing your skills as a designer. Even if you're a UX designer, develop those skills. Try to find ways that you can really showcase the essence of what you do. And then when a hiring manager sees your work, they say, okay, well, they understand a little bit of methodology, but they are great designers, and we can do a lot more with someone who's a great designer or has that potential than someone who just happens to have educated themselves on the latest methodology when it comes to product design. So that's number two. And tell me if you want me to speed things up a little bit. But another thing that I always say, and this is not specific to new designers or people trying to find their way in, but committing, it's almost like a lifelong commitment to a beginner's mindset. And the way that I see that is, I alluded to it a moment ago, when you graduate school, you don't really know anything. You got to learn things over the next few years as you move into employment. But even beyond that, learning has to be a part of continuing to evolve and to grow and to create more opportunities for yourself, whether that's, podcasts or books that are relevant. And, what those books are, I think it's less relevant. Like, even an example, I was reading a book about, it was about meditation, written by a meditation instructor. And they had talked about the concept of nothingness and how absence in our worlds speaks volumes, and made the correlation back to design. Like, design is about that. It's about absence. It's about the lack of material and using that space to help craft it. So being able to learn those things, and maybe things that are outside of the typical design realm, and then incorporate that into the work, understanding things more conceptually and even more on a human level, like, study things about human behavior and stuff like that, continually to do that, and have this beginning mindset that you acknowledge to yourself that I don't know really anything. Like, in 2023, I've been working as a designer for 20 years, but I don't know what's going to happen in the next 10 years. So the only way for me to be able to stay relevant in that time, I need to keep learning. And in addition to that, I really feel at my best when I am learning, when I'm absorbing information, when I'm taking inspiration in. And as designers, we put a lot out there. Like, we put ourselves on the screen and invite 20 people into the room and say, judge us on the work that we've done. So, that's obviously, it's obviously a challenging thing, but being able to rejuvenate yourself with external sources of inspiration, books, podcasts, helps replenish that. So even though you're putting a lot out there into the world to be judged, you're also taking a lot in, and that balances things out, so you don't feel like you're draining yourself every time you're having to put something new out. And I think that's a problem that a lot of designers fall into. They burn out because they've given everything they can and they're not taking anything in. Cool. So that's number 3. And the fourth one is, I guess, somewhat related to that, but one of the biggest challenges for me, and I would say this was definitely the case earlier on, but still has followed me into my more senior days, especially when I've gone into a different environment where things have been done differently. Start developing techniques to manage your own mental state. Designers, there's a lot of ups and downs. There's a lot of criticism and dare I say, some embarrassment when we miss the mark. And that's really hard to reconcile as a designer, because if you're constantly battling yourselves internally, how do you then focus on the solutions at hand? How do you be a good designer? And I often see that designers and perhaps beyond design, a lot of people in the world are their own protagonist and antagonist, at least in your own story. That's one of the biggest challenges that I think young designers face. And young designers are also getting a lot of rejection. They're applying for jobs and they're not hearing back, or they're going through 7 rounds of interviews only for them to get ghosted at the end. So you've got to take a lot of lumps, and that takes its toll after a while. So developing some strategies, things that work for you, that allow you to reconcile that and to be in control of your mental state, so you don't fall by the wayside when things don't go your way. And I see that as something that has been consistent throughout my whole career. And when I look back at my failures, they have been related to my mental state. I wasn't in the right mental state. I was overwhelmed, or I didn't fully understand something. And you hear people talk about the fear of failure and how you overcome failure and embrace failure in order to learn. But when it comes to your internal programming, it's not as easy to learn that, because it keeps reoccurring. So it's more about managing it and trying to get better at that balance, so you can obviously enable yourself to focus more on what you need to be doing, rather than being clouded by this internal narrative that is continuing to distract you from what you really should be doing. So I would just end that with saying, mental resilience is a designer's best friend, and whatever you can do to start doing that earlier on in your career, the better, because it does take a long time. It's not easy. You hear people say your own mind is one of the hardest things to conquer, and I totally agree with that. But starting early, knowing that that's something that you're going to have to deal with, is obviously giving you a heads up.
Thank you so much, Alexander. Those were some really great, wonderful advices. So let's begin today's episode with intersection of digital design and branding. So how would you define the intersection of digital design and branding, and why is it essential in today's digital landscape?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the landscape now, where we find ourselves is good design is table stakes. It's found everywhere. It's ubiquitous, but there's little to differentiate that. And if you look back to design of the past, there was a lot more personality within design that could help, I guess, separate one product from the next, or at least give one product a competitive advantage over another. And it's those attributes that, that really bring something unique and special. And in a world of homogenization, when products are the same, that's becoming more and more of a requirement. Like, how do we go beyond just this consensus or this, this table stakes type of approach that produces different products and elevate it in a way that can be unique to us? And I think part of that is, we've relied a lot on external factors when it comes to how do we validate good design. Like we're saying right now that, users, and we're designing products for users, so they need to be the ones that determine what good design is. But, and I don't disagree with that. But above that, we need to also think about what does our brand stand for and how do those attributes incorporate themselves into the products that we're developing. And there's definitely some examples of products doing that. Airbnb is one that definitely comes to mind that, it feels like obviously a utilitarian app, but it also has more brand essence coming through it. I feel like I'm interacting with a personality as much as I am interacting with a utility application. How I define the intersection of digital design and branding is really the unification of brand differentiation with product utility. So how do you combine both of those elements into the same thing and almost, not separate them, and it is one thing. So incorporating the brand expression into digital design products is obviously the first thing, and unifying brand values and principles with design. And I'll talk about that in a little moment. But some other areas that can be incorporated, and I think also when we, as product designers, we see what the brand teams do, and sometimes it can feel a little bit more tailored towards managerial groups and can feel like there's a lot of jargon associated with it. But generally, a lot of work goes into defining what these values and principles are with organizations, and being able to incorporate that it allows there to be that unification, or at least that connection between what we're doing on the product design side versus what's being done on the brand side. And it doesn't feel like completely different entities. And referencing your internal values rather than external values, because again, I think we tend to look at what's happening in the industry, what's Google doing, what methodologies are the latest and producing the most effective results. We're looking externally for what those values and principles are, when I think that there needs to be a little bit more of a introspective look at the organization and what do our values stand for? How do we want to express our products? How do we want to make products that do differentiate from all the others? Because if we're just doing what Google does and all of the Silicon Valley startups, then we're going to get what they're getting. And that just adds to clutter of options. Differentiation is only going to help. It's going to help us stand out of the clouds. It's going to give our customers more to be able to resonate with and associate with. So, starting with that and then also moving on to, what other factors besides incorporating the brand expression into the digital products and unifying brand values and principles with design. I think it's also, the personality. Brands have personality. That's the way that they're created. Every visual asset or communication is always reflected in some way of what that personality is. That goes the same for storytelling. And I think also something that has probably been forgotten about a little bit in the last 10 years is that element of surprise and delight, because everything has become so homogenized and patterns are very similar, and we've kind of resorted to doing things the same way. But surprise and delight has a lot of power. We're emotional beings, and we respond to the ability to perform tasks well, but we also respond to surprise and delight, and even more so when we're talking personality, storytelling, and surprise and delight. That really is the key factor in perhaps elevating the relationship between the product and the user beyond just giving them a useful tool. And, at the end of the day, customers have so much choice. there's so many products that do the same thing. They can pick and choose whatever they want. And I think that's the climate that we've almost created. We've said all power to the users, which means that it's a user's market, but we're a business also. We need to make money. We need people to choose our products, and then we need them to choose our products again. So we have to give them something more than just the competitors. We need to be able to provide something more that they can resonate with. And that comes down to those things. It's the storytelling, it's the personality, it's the surprise and the delight, it's the brand differentiator, bringing in those brand values, ensuring that what we do for product design, part of the brand, it's not separate, it lives within the brand because it's expressing the same intent that the brand ultimately wants to express.
So Alexander, what are some of the key considerations when designing digital experiences that align with brand's identity and value?
I think that the shared values and principles is a big one, because a lot of the time companies have defined their values and their principles across the company. And I think a lot of the time, that doesn't necessarily mean a lot. It's more sort of corporate speak. It's something that managerial people throw around and talk about how this is defining the future. But what we have at Nokia, just to give you a little bit of context of where I'm coming from, our principles across the organization are human, dynamic, radically simple. So human is obviously, we're a human-centric company. We're designing products for human beings. Dynamic is, we're always looking for ways to improve, for innovation. And then radically simple is almost like a callback to some of our roots, the Nordic design aesthetic, and keeping things simple, removing what doesn't need to be there, almost like a traditional type of minimalistic design approach. And that's kind of the way that I explained those was more of our own design interpretation. Whether or not the executives within Nokia see that translation as the same isn't applicable, because we've been able to create our own interpretation of what that is. And I think that why this is relevant to some of your listeners is because with product design and with these industry-wide advancements when it comes to methodology and ways of doing things and tools, we're often now looking at external factors to determine what those values are. So we'll see what Google's doing and we'll be like, okay, well, that's what we should be doing. That's the values that we should be following. And while there's, of course, an opportunity to keep an eye on everything that's happening, it needs to some way tie back to your own organization. Otherwise, you're just trying to force in a different process into something that may not necessarily be receptive to it. So being able to figure out how to do that, and that's really the next part of the answer is how do you do that? How do you take values that may not necessarily have been designed for designers, but they're more about how do we talk about Nokia as a organization when we're talking to customers and going out there in the world. But for us, it's about taking those values and interpreting them in ways that is relevant to us. It's focusing on how do we take something like radically simple, express that in different ways, in different details throughout the experience. Like, do we look at even breaking things down to a very granular level? We have a button and maybe there's an extra detail on the button. And, we remove that because, it doesn't serve that value as radical simplicity. And, radically simplicity isn't just simple, it's extreme simplicity. So we really use that to evaluate our own designs, but also carry that knowledge into the work that we're doing. So as we're developing products and mobile applications and web portals, we're thinking about these brand principles and how they relate to us and ensuring that they're incorporated into the work that we're doing. And I think, as time goes on, you start to the hang of using that and not only just incorporating it into the work, but also articulating that when you're working with stakeholders within the organization. And a lot of big companies do have a lot of stakeholders, and often that can be one of the most challenging aspects of a designer is being able to communicate why this design works. And always tying back decisions that you've made based on Nokia's principles or any organization's principles seems to just resonate at a deeper level than if I was just to come in and say, we made this button more simple because, we don't want to distract the user. We've really embraced these principles and these values, and that's manifesting itself in everything as small as a button or every little detail. And it becomes, we've basically flown the flag or continue to fly the flag of the brand. And in that process, they don't see us as this competing team. They see us as, they're here to work with us. And again, speaking back to that intersection, really is becoming the unification of brand and product design or digital design. And the embracement of those values, even if you do interpret them different ways, I think is really a valuable thing in order to, to have some strategies that, can align with the brand team's aspirations and vice versa.
Thank you so much, Alexander. So how can user experience design influence brand perception and customer engagement in the digital realms?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one. And I'll talk a little bit more about how to measure design, essentially, because that always has been a tricky one. But the way that I've always seen design, and perhaps it's gotten a little bit diluted in recent years, but good design helps the user and great design influences the user. And there's a big distinction there, because if I can provide a product where I can make it 3 clicks for a user to perform a task, that's great. But as soon as another product comes out that can do it in 2 clicks, that user has no association or no loyalty to that particular product. They're going to go with the best feature. What designers need to think about more so is not just providing a path for the users, but how do we influence the user? How do we try to entice them to do specific things? And that can be more bottom line related. I guess, we want to encourage conversion or whatever the app type is. There's things like that we need to think about influence and how design plays a role in that influence, not just to accommodate the user, but to try and provide an alternative path that allows the user to perhaps invest more or commit longer to their subscription with this application. And knowing that, again, design is a business and businesses need to make money. And as designers, we need to be able to design in a way that we can encourage users to go down those pathways rather than feeling like we're just coddling the user and giving them exactly what they want. Of course, we want them to enjoy using the experience. But we also want to make sure that our message is coming through, that we want you to subscribe or we want you to buy our product. We want you to do something for us, not just us do something for you. And I think that's something that really does separate different levels of design. Yeah, anyone with Figma and a good methodology can put together something that's usable, but a really good designer, regardless of methodology, can create a design that has that influence. And that ties back to some of the things that I mentioned before about, what other areas, whether it be surprise and delight, integration of brand, or the unification of brand and product design. So you have that personality and that storytelling coming into play. So it gives the user more to grasp than this is just the fastest way to do it. I want to use this product because, I feel like it has similar values. And, a lot of the time outside of product design and design in general, people gravitate towards brands that they have some kind of shared values, or I would say more accurately, shared identities. If I buy a Patagonia jacket, for example, me wearing Patagonia shows that, I'm an outdoor type of person. I like to head over to the redwoods in Mill Valley and things like that. And it says a lot about who we are. And collectively speaking, Patagonia wearers have this, almost like connection with one another because we all believe in the same thing. And I think that's where brand really has a powerful role to play. If Patagonia, for instance, were just to, give really basic shirts or whatever without all that storytelling and without those brand values and communicating what they stand for, it's just another shirt and people will just choose another one that fits better or, they like the color of. But Patagonia is able to distinguish themselves above those competitors because they have that strong story to tell. And, I think also it's about, to some extent creating dependencies and you do that through and getting back more into the product design space. There's so many food service apps out there at the moment, and I often finding myself using Uber Eats. I wouldn't say that's the perfect app or anything, but I feel like there's more substance to that. There's more purpose to that than a lot of others. And that's enough for me to use it. And it's not just because I'm a designer and I notice those details. I just feel like the experience isn't just shuffling me through the process in order for me to put down my card details and move me on. I feel like there's a little bit of consideration in, okay, how do we make this very quick process enjoyable for the user. And it's that type of consideration that I think really makes a difference when it comes to, how do you use user experience combined with brand to create customer engagement in this space.
Thank you, Alexander. So with the increase of reliance on mobile devices, how can designers ensure a consistent brand experience across different screen sizes and platforms?
Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting question, and I think it depends on various factors. But there was a time years ago when mobile design was pretty new. Like I said, I was at the very early stages of that. But what it was mostly about was taking something from a bigger screen size and just cramming it into a mobile screen, which didn't always provide the best user experience. Things have become a lot more sophisticated, and I think we understand a lot more now the difference in behaviors between a desktop user and a mobile user, or a VR user, whatever other types of interfaces we're going to experience. But what is the most important thing is each one of these products or devices have different behaviors, and obviously provides quite a lot of insight. If you're on your phone, you're not necessarily looking to spend a lot of time. You're not going to be using any complex applications. It's more about consuming information, get your quick dose of endorphins and then move on. So I think that it's definitely interesting how that has evolved over time, and now the behaviors of how those different devices are used differently based on that behavior. But I also think it's quite interesting because there has been behaviors developed around mobile, and you look at a lot of application design and there's a lot of similarities, how navigations are structured, how iconography is developed. Like you could probably take quite a few products that exist out there, line them up and say, yeah, they're all pretty much the same when it comes to UX patterns. So I think that there's another step to this that I think is consistent with other things that I've been saying, and that is to be innovative when you're looking at these different spaces and not just depend on previous patterns that have been done to death over the last few years. And some examples of that, TikTok is one. I'm not like a super big fan of TikTok or anything like that, but where did that pattern come from? Like, sure, there was some science early where how that was slowly developing, but it definitely doesn't follow the standard UI type of interface. And granted, it's not a utilitarian application. It's not a network management tool or anything like that. Patterns and conventions and even the status quo is always up for grabs. And that's what we should be doing as designers. And you may say, well, why is that the responsibility of designers? And my answer to that is, good designers need to be innovative. They shouldn't be people that are happy with the status quo and happy just to continue doing things how they've always been done. Because if you do things how they've always been done, you're going to keep getting what you've always gotten. So a designer should really be innovative. And even, in the spaces that we work in at Nokia, it can be, very dense platforms that, there's not a lot of room for surprise and delight. We're building products B2B. They're designed for technicians that have been using these types of tools for many years. They don't really care about much else besides being able to perform their tasks. But that doesn't mean that, we just become complacent and keep doing what we're doing, because there's always something to improve and there's always ways that things can get better. And we are, regardless of B2B or from, one culture to the next, we're all human beings and we all have similar emotional responses to the things that we put in our hands. And understanding that as a designer, I think gives you an advantage. How do we create more a relationship with our user than just giving them the opportunity to perform their task? And again, that's how the brand aspect comes in, is ensuring that, we do push that brand into the product and tell that story along with all of the other touch points that we have within the organization.
So Alexander, what role does storytelling play in digital design and branding, and how can it be effectively incorporated into the user experience?
Yeah, so storytelling, I've mentioned a couple of times already, and it is important. I think it's probably something that, I don't hear as much about storytelling as maybe I did 10 years ago or so. And I think perhaps that's because storytelling, creates a lot of ambiguity and it's not as black and white. And I think that where we've tried to reconcile that is we've tried to create more black and white in the design process, less ambiguity. less subjectivity and make it more of a process that can deliver X quality day in, day out. And I understand that from a corporation, it's all about, getting money, getting efficiency and squeezing your design team as much as possible. But I think to some extent, it has, perhaps been at the sacrifice of other important aspects like storytelling. And if you think about storytelling and all of its history, it has been so important and so integral to our societies ever since the early man. Like that's how we were able to take, complex information or complex observations. I see a woolly mammoth, and rather than saying everything that I said, I tell a story about it, and I tell a story that, makes me seem like the hero. And that's just part of our DNA or our makeup as people and as human beings. And the reason that is because stories resonate with us. Like if you tell me a list of features on an app that we're discussing, it's going to probably fly over my head. But if you can tell it in a story, then okay, I can understand that. I understand what you're trying to do, and we can, connect on that. It really is the way that we communicate. Great communicators tell stories in the way that they're explaining. And I think that that's absolutely something that needs to be further emphasized in product design and digital design in general, because we're able to access that emotional side of the brain that we know has so much influence on the behavior of the user. So I think that's, it's definitely an important aspect of design and something I think we need to even more emphasis moving forward. And, like I said before, if you can tell a great story and someone can identify with that story, you're allowing that person to also identify with that story just by using your product or in some way interacting with your brand. So stories are really important, even though they don't get a lot of airtime lately. I think that stories has to be a part of any product experience, even if it is really something quite dry. There's got to be some remnants of that as a part of it. Otherwise, we're designing tables more than anything else, and good designers need to be contributing more than that.
Thank you so much, Alexander. So what strategies do you recommend for measuring the impact and effectiveness of digital design on brand awareness and customer loyalty?
Yeah, measuring the impact of design is always challenging. It always has been in the past. It was all about winning awards and getting recognition because there was no other way to really determine this is good design. Of course, there's, more modern ways of doing it, more accurate ways of doing it, looking at, task success rates, being able to monitor users, efficiency metrics, conversion rates, customer feedback, whether that be in the App Store. I'm a little skeptical about that because I've never written a review in the App Store. So sometimes I feel maybe that's more of an angry minority that's perhaps not necessarily providing an accurate reflection of the design. But I think in addition to all of that, there's so many ways that you can use to validate the design, but it's not necessarily the design that's being validated so much when you're going through those methods. Yes, there's, design means a lot, and design covers a broad array of disciplines, but, when you're measuring an app or a product in some way and you're using these techniques to validate that, it's not just the design that's being validated. Maybe there's some technical deficiencies that may also be playing a role in not so great feedback. So it's always hard to decouple design and then really point to the design and say this design specifically has been able to contribute X amount of value to this product. It's really hard to do that without just ongoing research and testing. And I think sometimes that can be a little bit excessive to really extract information that maybe doesn't come to much of a conclusion or a consensus in the end. But I think another thing that's probably more personal to me, and I'm sure that there's plenty of designers out there that disagree, but one way that I do measure the impact of the design that I work on or my team works on is my own assessment of the maintaining of that design integrity throughout the lifespan of the project. It's something that I feel we're leaning less on more recently than what we have been in the past. As a designer, you have a refined sensibility when it comes to design, or at least that's the thinking. You're able to determine what's good and what isn't. So I think rather than looking for external validation, like looking for the user to tell you what good design is, or perhaps looking outside of the organization, looking at the industry, if you feel like that the design that you've put together is good and you've perhaps won some really significant battles along the way to ensure that what you were really pushing for has made it through to the final build, and you feel like the integrity of your design or your team's design hasn't been compromised at any point, or maybe, very little throughout the entire process, then I feel like that is impactful enough. And, again, I know that there'd be a lot of people that disagree with that, but as a designer, we know good design. And if we feel good about design, then that's successful, because otherwise it's hard to tie any of these other metrics back to revenue or bottom line or anything like that. But being able to say to yourself, I'm proud of the work. We didn't compromise on the integrity of the design, and it works, and we're able to kind of really drive a lot of the decision making. I would say that from within a design team, that's a really great way of measuring the impact that you've had on a project. If you get relegated to pushing pixels in Figma and just getting told what to do by the program manager, even if that product goes on to, sell millions and, get capital raised, is that because of the design, or is there something else? Like, I think the only way to isolate design is to be satisfied with your own design, or to hold yourself accountable. And when it's not good enough, again, hold yourself accountable to that and push it. If you feel like you are starting to lose that integrity, then do what you can to regain it. And that's what you can do as a designer, rather than worry too much about, trolls on the internet and people writing negative reviews, which I don't think necessarily paints a clear picture of the impact of design or the impact of the product in its totality. I'd much more just to think about, okay, well, what do we do as an individual designer? And do we feel like we've done the best that we can do? We have the sensibility, so we should be able to provide a educated evaluation on the end design. So I think that, that's sometimes enough. Everyone has to just be who they are, and, we wake up and go to bed with ourselves. So we spend more time. So why not satisfy ourselves more than, some random tester somewhere or some troll on the internet that writes negative feedback? And I think that, that really, reminds me of a quote, and probably one of my favorite quotes, which again is somewhat controversial in recent design conversations around, design is now about the user. It's all about coming up with what suits the user best. But one of my favorite designers, Saul Bass, once said, "I want everything we do to be beautiful. I don't give a damn whether the client understands that that's worth anything, or that the client thinks it's worth anything, or whether it is worth anything. It's worth it to me. It's the way I want to live my life. I want to make beautiful things, even if nobody cares." And to me, that's really empowering. Like, I can't change everything. I can't, make sure that everyone in the world likes the app, but I can be true to myself, and I can have my own values, my own principle, and know exactly what I hold as design with integrity, and do my very best to make sure that I can push that as far as it can possibly go. So I think that it's, again, it creates a lot of pressure, all of these stakeholders that I have to appease. But at the end of the day, it's yourself. You're going to be holding yourself to the highest standard more than anyone else. So why not utilize that to your favor?
Thank you so much, Alexander. That was a really wonderful perspective. So, Alexander, can you share an example of a particularly challenging digital branding project you worked on, and how you and your team approached it? How do you see the future of digital design and branding evolving with AI coming into the picture?
I love this question. AI is such a topical thing right now, but I'll start with the first part. It's a little difficult to, I guess, describe a typical project at Nokia, because they are all so different. And, we work across so many different spaces within Nokia that they're always run differently. And that's what I like about Nokia. There's so much variety. But I would say when I look at all of the projects that we work on, one of the biggest challenges that I find reoccurring more than anything else, at least in the position that I'm in, is how do we demonstrate the value of design? And I think that that's something that a lot of designers grapple with, because not every company is Apple. And I even think to some extent, even Apple isn't Apple, that they're this design-led company and design is held at the highest possible place, and then everyone has to just kind of get behind it. Most companies aren't like that. So being able to constantly evangelize design and ensure that people can see the value And developing those skills in order to be able to rationalize and articulate why design is important is something that's always challenging, because different personalities, different teams that may care about certain aspects, and maybe they're so technical that it's difficult to connect in certain areas. But it's still one of the biggest challenges, and it always has been. And when you think about, sometimes in some cases, the difference between, a really good design or something that you're really going to be happy with, and it's going to feel like it really represents the skills and the effort that your team's made, to then get to that final step and not be able to get that alignment with stakeholders can be quite demoralizing, and it's always a challenge. And there's definitely things that can be done to improve that, and something that I mentioned before about the values and incorporating values into the way that the design is demonstrated and showcased, and how you can rationalize design decisions against company values. That changes the dynamic a little bit. It's not just about us designers, being indulgent and telling everyone else that we want to do this because we think it's cool. We want to do this because we think it's in the best interest of the company, because we're really embodying these designs in every detail. And that changes the dynamic of those conversations a little bit. Not always. It's still definitely something that is a big part of my role, and probably will continue to be so moving forward. But I would say consistently, that's always the case. How do we showcase that? How do we make people that don't know a lot about design or understand, the value that design can bring? How do we convince those people? So yeah, there's that. And then AI is definitely interesting. I've spent a lot of time playing around it with myself, with Midjourney. I got addicted to Midjourney for about 2 weeks, where I was up till 3 a.m. in the morning coming up with photos and things. So I had to cool it back a little bit. But I'm sure it will impact design in some way. I don't think that's necessarily going to be replacing designers. I mean, maybe in the future. We're still pretty early on, and I would say the technology is still fairly primitive. Like, when you really get down to it, it does some interesting things, and it's like, wow, but it's still primitive. Like, for it to do something that is done by a designer right now, I don't think it's quite there. But it's definitely going to be a game changer. And where I think that the most immediate change is going to be is in the space of perhaps removing some of the tedious elements of design. So rather than, and I can't think of any specific examples, but rather than, designers renaming files or, recropping images and stuff that I remember doing when I was a junior designer, all that tedious work that you would spend a week on, and you were supposed to be, earning your lumps as you did that. But I think a lot of that can be removed, and what that results in is a collective elevation in the skills across the entire industry. Because if designers can now rely on AI or certain tools to almost completely remove that low-level design, tedious tasks, that means more people are focusing on the more important aspects. So I see that AI potentially contributing to a leap forward in design, and allowing, the designers that we have now and the designers that are coming up to be at a much higher level of skill than what they were 10 years ago. And I think that there can be some correlations between that and, recent developments in sports science, for instance. Like, you look at runners from the 70s, they just didn't look like runners. Whereas you look at, I'm talking about kind of Olympic sprinters and, Olympic athletes. But today's athletes, they're on a whole new level. Like, they've got the sports science, they've got the nutrition. And I see AI as potentially being one of those things that has the ability to propel the entire industry of design forward. But it does it collectively. Everyone gets the same boost. And I think that's a good thing, because that means the design of the future is going to be far more elevated than what it is today, because we're able to remove some of the, the low level stuff that occupies probably more of our time than what the more important stuff does. So I think that's definitely it. On another hand, when it comes to AI, there is also, the way that I see it is both, the visual side of things, Midjourney and ChatGPT. They're basically going through content that exists already online. They're extracting it, and they're in some way putting it together and producing a result. But nothing new is necessarily being added to that. So it makes me think, well, in order to sustain AI, new content has to continually be created in order to keep feeding it and keep allowing it to move forward with the needs of everyone else. So that perhaps places more of a premium on original content creation. And I think that's interesting because, a lot of people talk about AI is going to take our jobs and all that kind of stuff, but I think it almost creates more opportunity to create real good content. Maybe that ends up being in the AI database and it gets served up to students trying to write their essays, but it still depends on that. There's still going to be a premium for that original content. And I think that's the same for design as well. Like there has to be something to reference in order for design to be created. And with designers also, something like Midjourney, or say if in the future there's a version of that creates products, like digital products, a client or a customer can't use that tool because they don't have the design sensibility. And even when I experiment with Midjourney, I'll go through hundreds and hundreds of variations because I'll be like, no, I don't like that. I don't like how, that's composed, and really small details that I start picking apart. And as I was doing that, it's like, designers still need to look at this type of results that have been generated by AI and still determine whether it's good or whether it has the right design sensibility in order for it to be acceptable. And there'll always be room for designers, and perhaps design maybe shifts a little bit back more towards the ideation side and the art direction side, as opposed to being purely executional. And I think that's a shift that we have seen over the last 10, 15 years, where ideation was kind of seen as the old school and then execution was the new school, because ideas aren't worth anything unless you can execute on them. Whereas now perhaps we're shifting back again to now ideas is really where the value lies. Execution is worth nothing because I can use AI, but I still need to be able to art direct AI. I still need to be able to provide my own design sensibility or my own creative sensibility in order to ensure the content that I'm creating through AI is going to be the most optimum standards of work. So I think that's my take on AI. Who knows how it's going to play out? We'll have to see. It's definitely going to have an impact, but I think people just need to to be a little bit more realistic. It's not going to be robots coming into our offices and kicking us out or anything like that anytime soon.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for sharing all these wonderful perspectives with us. So could you please share with us, how does your day look like? Any interesting stories?
Yeah, so to be honest, a lot of my days consist of meetings, a lot of meetings, and I know that there's a lot of negative connotations around that. Like, you spend your whole time in meetings and it kind of feels like a waste of a day or, however long. And I personally used to resist this. I was like, I'm spending all this time in meetings. I need to be doing work. But I think at some point I started to realize that that's where things happen. Like, the room where it happens is the meeting room, and you've got to be present in those conversations. Even mentioning what I spoke about before, rationalizing your design decisions and tying that into brand values, that becomes a really important part of the design process, because if you can't sell it in and you can't get the consensus of all the stakeholders, then it's going to fall on the cutting room floor. So I've learned to embrace the meeting and see that as an opportunity that's where things are going to happen. That's where decisions are made, and we need to be a part of that. And that's where we can really shine. Like, we can show our work, we can talk about the rationale, we can, blow people's minds with the work that we do. And that's the forum to do it. So I've learned to embrace meetings and that be a skill set that I've spent more and more time developing, like how to conduct myself in meetings, how best to articulate design, how to, ensure that people are being heard and there's a spirit of collaboration in those meetings. So it's become something that, like I said, I used to resist and reluctantly attend meetings and perhaps write emails to another person while I was sitting in the meeting and feeling like this is such a waste of time. But now I know, if you really want to have influence in a company, and, we've talked about influence in different contexts so far, being able to have a seat at the table and being involved in those conversations gives you that influence, and it's something to be embraced. And it's not like you're abandoning design; you're just understanding design at another level, because you're understanding that design on Figma is one thing, but then how does that then turn into something that we love into into something that the stakeholders are going to love also. And that's a big chasm that needs to be crossed. And being in those meetings, being the voice of design is the key to that. So I've embraced the role of doing that, even though sometimes, 6 hours of meetings in a row can get to you at times, for sure.
Thank you so much, Alexander. So we'll conclude the show by your 3 favorite book recommendations and people who inspire you the most in this space.
There's a couple. I've read a lot of books, and like I said at the beginning of the call, that beginner's mindset has been something that I've tried to apply throughout my career, and constantly learning different things, not just design, but all other aspects of creativity and art and business and psychology. But I would say when people ask me, what are my top 3 books that I found most beneficial, but also practical, are the following. The first one is Start With Why by Simon Sinek. It's a pretty common and well-known book now, but the present premise is basically, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So it's all about some of the things that I've spoken about, that storytelling, that differentiator when it comes to products. And it's a really good book to kind of form a strong opinion around design and marketing. And it does provide that extra level of context that I assume a lot of young designers probably don't get exposed to until later in their life, and they're moving into management and starting to think about these things. But I would definitely recommend a book like that to someone who's graduated from school, because it does start to paint a picture about, there's more to design than just moving things in Figma. It's about psychology, it's about emotion, it's about all these human things that really determine whether a human being turns left or they turn right. And that's really fascinating to me. And I'm sure it'll be fascinating to a lot of designers that are curious about design and get into it, but want to learn a little bit more at a different level. The next one is a book called Radical Candor, which was written by Kim Scott. And Kim Scott is a Silicon Valley veteran who's worked at Google, Apple, and all of the big places. And I guess the main message of that book is, it's about managing teams, and the examples are often in places like Google. But the radical candor concept basically is broken down into a bit of a matrix, and it is described as is the ability to care personally and the ability to challenge directly. So getting that balance right is the sweet spot when it comes to management. So obviously, you want to be able to have good relationships with your team. You want to be able to help them out if they need it. You want to be able to have empathy, or if they're having issues, be willing to support them, give them time off, and really care about not just what they're doing for you, but them as people. But the second part of that, and probably the more difficult part, is challenging them directly, is being able to say, this isn't good enough, or, you need to try some more variations, and you need to be real with people in that sense. So you're not just, if you were just to care personally, you're basically, you're coddling them. You're just trying to be their friend, and you're not helping them grow. But if you're challenging them directly, you're forcing them to grow, because you're pushing them to the next level. And that constant push, balanced by your own personal interest in their development, is key, because if you can do those both things, it doesn't feel like they're being attacked or anything like that, because they know you care about their development. So I've found that formula really interesting, and it's a whole book, so it goes into much more detail. I think that's probably more appropriate for people who are looking to become managers or just become managers, maybe not so much young designers getting into the industry, but definitely a really good book to read, and probably has dated a little bit over the years, is still a really good book in terms of its fundamentals. The last one is, I'm a huge fan of the author, I think you would say maybe poet, of Alan Watts, who was, he's a British guy who lived in North California for a long time. And when I really started getting into his books, I was living in Northern California, so I felt a little bit connected to what he was saying. But kind of what I was saying before, stress and anxiety are your own worst enemy, and it's difficult to overcome that. Like, it's easy to overcome mistakes that you make on the job, but that stress that you feel and the constant critique of the work that you're putting forward takes its toll. And Alan Watts, just to give a little bit of background, is all about Eastern religions, bringing that into society in the West. And it's really good to be able to kind of separate stress from life and almost acknowledge it, but not necessarily engage with it. And because I mentioned earlier on that the biggest challenge that all designers face is just that internal battle, the writings of Alan Watts and the book that I've mentioned here is The Wisdom of Insecurity, but there's a whole library of other books that he's written, even on YouTube, that is really interesting. But but being able to kind of like, separate your anxieties and your stress from your identity and the work that you're doing, I think is really helpful. It's a lifelong effort, but encouraging anyone. I always try to share this with people that I know, because I know how much it can help just keep you clear as you're working, and not overreact when small things happen, and keep your composure, and just come to terms that it's life's short, and we've got to do the best that we can, and getting caught up in all of these trivialities doesn't help us. It hurts us more than anything else. So that book's a great reminder of that, and one that I find myself coming back to. Other designers, I really like to look at art more so than design specifically. Olafur Eliasson, one of my favorite artists, just does some really, what I would say, transcendent art that I've experienced a couple of times here in Sydney. And I find myself just really inspired when I see that stuff. And I love the feeling of attending a gallery and seeing something that I'm just blown away by, and then taking that energy back into the design studio and being filled with all this inspiration, and then being able to apply that to design. I think that that's something that designers need to do, is rejuvenate themselves, make sure that they're taking in as much as they're putting out, in order to create that balance, so they don't feel like they're being depleted and ultimately burnt out. But yeah, that's my go-tos when it comes to resources and inspiration.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for sharing all these wonderful recommendations and resources with us. We're looking forward to host you again in our upcoming episodes. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate you. Yeah, let me know if there's anything else you need in the future.